Chapter 17, The Depositions. For the next few weeks, I spent time with my family in Arizona. The stress in my life was taking a toll on my mother's already declining health. One morning, I was sitting on the porch when I received a phone call from Lanny. A film crew from the British Broadcasting Company in England contacted Lanny because they heard about my case and was anxious to tell my story. I agreed to interview with them. The interview was about the Green Wall, which later became a documentary called America's Brutal Prisons. A week after the interview, Lanny told me that it was our turn to conduct depositions on the individuals that were involved in my case. I said goodbye to my parents, worried if that was going to be the last time I saw my mother. I picked up Lanny from his house and we started the long journey to Monterey, California. The drive was good for us. It cleared our heads as the thundering blue ocean pounded the shoreline next to us. The depositions of Edward Cadden, Chief Deputy Warden, retired California Department of Corrections. It was during the depositions that I met retired Chief Deputy Warden Edward Cadden. His demeanor was very professional and conclusive, a tall gentleman with grayish hair. When I looked at him, I felt that this man, who was once in charge of Salinas Valley State Prison, would provide us with some great evidence for my case. We sat around the conference table in a small office. The court reporter turned to Mr. Cadden. Mr. Cadden, you are to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Cadden replied, yes, I will. Do you know what the Green Wall is? Lanny asked. Do I know what the Green Wall is? Cadden repeated. Yes. In the context of this, yes. What is that? Cadden stated, it is an alleged group of rogue officers who were engaged in intimidation of staff and intimidation of inmates, planting evidence and things of that nature. Allegedly, this group also engaged in some, I guess I'd rather characterize it as sophomoric behavior by carving the initials GW or 723 in furniture or, vandalizing and things like that. Okay, well, we'll come to your experience as a warden at another time later in the deposition, and we can discuss this Green Wall some more. But let me just ask you one general question. At the time you were warden at Salinas Valley, did you ever look into the Green Wall? I'm going to have to ask you to clarify that question. Cadden replied back, what part was unclear? Were you ever asked to provide a corrective action plan with respect to the Green Wall? Yes. By whom? Cadden stated. George Galazza, the regional administrator in the Central Region. When did this take place, and were you the warden at Salinas Valley during that time? It's either the very end of January, I don't have that date clearly, but it was either the end of January or the beginning of February 2004, somewhere in there. Okay, Cadden explained further, I don't recall exactly what day Mr. Lamarcky left, and I assumed command. Lanny asked, before taking on the job as Chief Deputy Warden, had anyone discussed with you the allegations of the Green Wall at Salinas Valley State Prison? This is before you took the job on. Yes. By whom? Anthony Lamarcky, replied Cadden. How many discussions? It was one very brief discussion on May 8, 2002, and it was at the end of the interview for the position. What do you recall that Mr. Lamarcky said, and what did you say in reply? Cadden stated, it was something to the effect, I got the IG on my butt about this Green Wall thing. There is nothing to it. It's been investigated thoroughly. There is nothing to it, I asked him. Well, what's this Green Wall thing? And he says, oh, it's just a bunch of BS, trust me. There is nothing to it. And that was the extent of it. That was the conversation. Yeah, but you knew he was full of shit, I thought. After you arrived at Salinas Valley on Monday, did you have any further discussions with Mr. Lamarcky about the Green Wall? Yes, I did. How many? Asked Lanny. I believe it was only one conversation. I asked Mr. Lamarcky again, tell me about this Green Wall. What's this about? And he basically repeated to me that the Green Wall was this group of officers that are alleged to have been, engaging in intimidation and this kind of behavior. Again, he told me that, it's been thoroughly investigated, and he basically rephrased what he had. I'm sorry. He repeated what he had said the previous time. The only thing that I asked was, do you have any reports about this? Do you have any copies of the investigations? To which he responded that he did not. He had no reports. That's correct. That's what he told me. There were no reports at the institution about that investigation. And the lies start to unravel. I thought to myself, Lamarcky lied to Caden. The OIG had previously investigated the Green Wall and found out there was in fact a Green Wall gang that existed at the prison. Lamarcky was fully aware of the rogue officers that he commanded. Lanny asked Caden, okay, now did you at some point later in time find that to be untrue? Were there reports at the institution about the Green Wall investigation? Well, yes. When did you discover that? Date is real hazy, but it would have been around the end of January 2004. How is that you discovered that to be untrue? Lanny asked. This is a long answer. The day of a particular Senate hearing, I listened to the hearing on the internet link, heard the testimony about Salinas Valley, heard some detailed information about the alleged Green Wall group. It seemed to be at odds with what I had heard to that point. And I'm not taking this as true, what I'm hearing necessarily in front of the Senate, but it certainly raised some questions to me that I needed to resolve as the operating chief officer for the institution, as well as what was real and what's not. The next day I went in. This was over at my house on the grounds. I had some writing that I was trying to do that afternoon and just took off and went over there to do it. No phones. And the next day when I went into the office, that atmosphere was obviously very different. Mr. Lamarcky's name had come up at the end of the hearing. There was a report apparently introduced at the hearing from Steve White that was mostly uncomplimentary to Mr. Lamarcky. Lamarcky and I had discussion in his office about this testimony. He was quite concerned about the image that his institution was getting, and he was being portrayed in the media. There was obviously media attention that followed right on the heels of that Senate hearing. Lamarcky was on the phone at some point. I believe it was that morning with Central Region. I believe it was. Who was on the phone? Tom Scheffenfeld, Steve Borg, and I think it's Ray Wilkins. Those two are both captains at Central Region. Lamarcky was asking them for a copy of the report that had been introduced at the Senate hearing related to him. I was in the front office with him, so he's saying this on the speakerphone in front of me. He was telling the folks on the phone that the former regional administrator, Ernie Rowe, had promised him a copy of the report and the investigations and had never had provided it. He said that over lunch. Don't people recall this? There was a lunch over there in Bakersfield. Jim Hamlet coordinates CTF and Lamarcky went to Bakersfield, had this lunch with Ernie Rowe. Apparently, Ernie had the report and backup documents with it and was assigned to give Lamarcky a copy. That was something like a year prior to that, and Lamarcky was upset talking on the phone with him about the fact that he hadn't received it. They promised then to send by fax as we were on the phone a copy of this report, which they did. And Lamarcky got it from the fax machine himself, made a photocopy of it, handed the photocopy to me to read. He read it. Well, after that, and after we were on the phone, I recall having a conversation with Tony. This is an extremely damaging report. What's up with this? My impression is that this green wall doesn't exist. This thing is saying something, certainly giving an impression that's very different from that. I asked him again, are there any investigative reports here at the institution related to this? Anything related to this? He says, I don't know at this point. I remember calling somebody out in the investigative services unit. I don't remember whether it was Captain Moore or Lieutenant Middlebrooks or somebody out there, and said, I want you to bring any reports, any investigations relating to the Green Wall back up to the warden's office now. I think it was about 20 minutes later, there were 8 file boxes of material that were brought up to the office. I started reading through those boxes, and although I'm not going to discuss the contents of the boxes because those are privileged and would certainly be the subject of, but nonetheless, there were things in there that gave me concerns about the existence of some group of nefarious little critters. My reports were in those boxes, I thought. Lanny asked Caden, did you ever hear any discussions with anyone as to Vodka's reports as to the Green Wall investigation? Caden replied, in some very general terms. I remember Greg Lewis mentioning that Officer Vodka had written some reports that were addressed to him. And again, my recollection is that this was part of the dialogue that Lewis had with the Marquis when the Marquis was not being responsive to it. And that was part of it. You recall previously I was telling you about a conversation I was having with Greg Lewis. He was just kind of venting a little bit, and he did tell me that there were documents involved in it, and looks like this may have well been some of the stuff he was talking about. Another high notoriety issue involves citizens' complaints, filed by myself. The complaint was sent to the warden's office and protested that Sergeant James George, then assigned to the Investigative Services Unit, approached Mr. Vodka at the Paso Robles Fair and threatened and intimidated him about a lawsuit he had filed against another employee at the department. No action was taken pursuant to the penal code to properly address this complaint. Upon learning of this issue, I took immediate steps to administratively reassign Sergeant James George from ISU, ensure that a formal investigation was instituted, and I communicated directly with the attorney representing Mr. Vodka, giving him status of our efforts and my personal assurance that a thorough and fair investigation would be undertaken. This was addressed in the corrective action plan, Office of the Inspector General's reports related to the Green Wall and Code of Silence. When I met Mr. Edward Caden at our deposition, he was a man of integrity with a commitment to get the job done, an ethical individual who was committed to making positive changes at Salinas Valley State Prison. He emphasized to me that he conducted ethics training based on my testimony in front of the senators in Sacramento on the Green Wall at the prison. At the deposition, Mr. Caden told me that he had a 2-hour class that was developed for all staff at Salinas Valley State Prison, which focused on a clear set of values and ethical standards for conduct by all employees. At the conclusion, he gave strong warning to any staff member who was intent on violating the ethics of our profession, that if they do so at their own peril, and he has zero tolerance for deliberate misconduct. To this day, I have the utmost respect for Mr. Caden and what he did before retiring from the Department of Corrections. The deposition of Lieutenant Greg Lewis, California Department of Corrections. That same day, Lieutenant Greg Lewis was scheduled for his deposition. This was the first time I had seen him in over 3 years. I was a bit confused when he did not greet me or shake my hand. We were friends. We lived in the same neighborhood. Our families were close, and I was there for him when he was out of work due to an injury and throughout his divorce. We had even kept in contact after he left Salinas Valley State Prison. I had no idea why there was such tension between us. I just hoped he would be truthful during the deposition. Lanny began. Do you recall receiving this document? First of all, do you recognize this document? I noticed Lewis had the same harsh look on his face that he always displayed when addressing someone. Yes, he answered. What is this document? Lewis stated. This is a memorandum that I ordered Correctional Officer Vodka to write based upon his verbal report to me of this behavior. I thought about that report. He had me write about the Green Wall. Greg, you were told by Lieutenant Markey to order me and my partner Gino to write a report of our knowledge of the Green Wall. Did you discuss with him the contents of the document? I can't recall exactly, but I think it was 1 or 2 days prior to ordering him to write it. Where did you have the discussion? In the investigative lieutenant's office, just myself and Officer Vodka. How long was the meeting? Maybe 15 minutes. I started to stew. This meeting never took place between me and Lewis. He wasn't telling the truth. There was no meeting in your office. You took a golf cart and drove down to the Sally Port where Gino and I were working, and you told us both that we had to write our reports and bring them to you. Lanny continued. What was the meeting about, to your recollection, in the 15-minute conversation? Lewis stared right at me, and I stared right back. How could he be untruthful under oath? Lewis stated, I remember Officer Vodka relating that he had observed some behavior related to a group of officers that were associating themselves as the Green Wall. In your discussion, 15 minutes or so with Officer Vodka, did he describe the Code of Silence in addition to the Green Wall? I can't recall the specific verbal conversation. I can recall him expressing concerns if the information was to be leaked out or disclosed that he would be subjected to retaliation by his peers. What was your reply to that concern, or did you have one? I assured him that I would maintain this document as confidential, and I personally handed this document to 2 special agents from the Office of Internal Affairs. I met with Warden Lamarckey and requested an investigation, and part of the supporting documents that I requested was this memo. Yeah, right, Greg. How else did the institution know about my report? Any allegations of the planning of contraband by staff associated with the Green Wall? Only thing I can state was that an investigation was requested and initiated. Come on, Greg. You even told me that your evidence room officer advised you those members of the Green Wall entered the room and took several uncontrolled inmate manufactured weapons from the locker without signing in the evidence room for entry. This was told to you by your evidence officer. Did you ever tell Officer Negretti or Almager that there had been on one of the unit officers' desk a box of green pens that said, "Take one if you dare," Lanny asked. Yes, I reported that to the warden. I recommended an investigation be initiated into some of the supporting facts. The documents that the green ink was utilized on were legal documents which are required to be signed in black ink. Now, you said you have reviewed investigative logs of the unit officers. Was there a number of unit officers that had disciplinary or misconduct investigations? Yes. Did you ask Warden Lamarckey to do something about these investigations? Lewis explained that he asked Lamarckey and that he requested the employees be reassigned from the unit until the investigations were completed. Lamarckey denied Lewis's request. Lewis said he went back to the investigative services unit and had a discussion with all the unit members, and he spoke to them about his expectations of professionalism and following procedures. He said some staff responded with, "We're only doing what the warden has told us to do." Lanny questioned further, "Did any correctional officer at Salinas Valley State Prison ever tell you that Warden Lamarckey directed them to go out and install fear and intimidation in the inmates?" "Yes," answered Lewis. After the vodka handwritten memorandums, was there a time in which you were made aware of, what did you call this here? A green handled buck knife engraved with 723 on it being brought into the Salinas Valley State Prison? All I can say is I met with Warden Lamarckey and requested an investigation into misconduct by officers assigned to the Investigative Services Unit. What the hell, Greg? Why are you avoiding the full answers? You showed me the 989 investigation report that Lamarckey refused to sign for an investigation. Remember, it mentioned the officers bringing the knife into the prison? This is ridiculous. Is the introduction of a knife into a prison a violation of California Penal Code? Yes, it is, answered Lewis. Did you ever have a discussion with Officer Vodka that an investigation into the Green Wall 723 was not being followed up on with a timely manner? I do remember a discussion. I believe it took place after my attempt to initiate the investigation was denied by the warden. I do remember a discussion. I believe it took place after my attempt to initiate the investigation was denied by the warden. Yeah, Greg, it was at your house, or Labor Day weekend. In fact, he had several discussions. I didn't understand why Lewis was being so vague and dishonest with Lanny. The thoughts were swirling around in my head. What was Lewis hiding? Was someone telling him not to talk, threatening? Was he keeping his mouth shut so he can continue to climb up the ladder to a higher level position? I thought Greg was better than this. At the end of the deposition, we both stood up at the table, and I reached my hand out to shake Lieutenant Lewis's hand. He stared at me for a moment, then quickly turned his back on me and headed for the door. "You could have at least shaken your hand," Lanny said. "I guess our friendship is over," I muttered. The deposition of Correctional Officer Stephen Archibald, California Department of Corrections. On the day of Archibald's deposition, it was about 8 o'clock in the morning when I walked up to a petite lady, Attorney Mary Kane Simon, and Officer Archibald. I knew Archibald and I had left on bad terms, but I offered my hand in greeting anyway. Archibald didn't even acknowledge the handshake. He was sworn in by the court reporter, and then Lanny began. Have you ever had any discussions with Sergeant George about encounters Sergeant George has had with Officer Vodka? Lanny asked. Yes, Archibald stated. How many discussions have you had about the encounter or an encounter? Once or twice. Here we go again. He was good friends with George and didn't speak with him once or twice, like he claims. Once or twice, do you recall when that was? No, it was the time that, he was removed from the squad for apparently a conflict he had had with him at the fairgrounds. Bullshit, Archibald. You and George carpooled. You even told him that you were supposed to reveal all your financial assets to the Attorney General for our testimony, which made you very scared. What was it that Sergeant George said was the conflict at the fairgrounds?